Most people see a Gilded Age mansion as the symbol of a family's triumph, stone walls carved from ambition and money. But this estate belonged to a man whose death made Americans cheer in the streets, a man so feared that newspapers called him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street. When Jay Gould's body lay inside these walls in 1892, the mansion did not echo with mourning, it echoed with relief. And as the nation celebrated outside, this house held the one secret Gould never intended to share: how one home could be built on power, paranoia, and the precise engineering of a nation's darkest economic games. Jay Gould was born in 1836 on a farm in Roxbury, New York. The land was rocky, the work was brutal, the money was scarce. His father worked soil that barely produced. His mother died when Jay was young. The boy grew up thin, frail, and chronically ill. Tuberculosis shadowed him from childhood. He coughed through winters, he struggled through harvests. But he possessed something the farm could never contain: a relentless, calculating mind. At 15, Gould left the farm. He taught himself surveying. He created maps for New York counties, precise, detailed, profitable. By 18, he was selling those maps to railroads hungry for expansion. He saw the pattern early. Information was leverage. Maps showed where track could go. Track meant land value. Land value meant control. Gould moved to New York City in his early 20s. He entered the tanning business. He manipulated his partner out of ownership. He sold the company at a profit. The pattern repeated: identify opportunity, seize control, extract maximum value, move on. Then came railroads. In 1867, Gould set his sights on the Erie Railroad. It was one of America's major rail lines, connecting the Great Lakes to New York City. It carried freight, passengers, and enormous potential profit. It was also financially unstable and ripe for takeover. Gould allied with two other operators, Jim Fisk and Daniel Drew. Together, they orchestrated one of the most audacious financial schemes in American history. They printed illegal stock certificates. They flooded the market with worthless shares. They manipulated prices up and down at will. When Cornelius Vanderbilt tried to buy controlling interest, Gould simply created more shares out of thin air. Vanderbilt spent millions buying stock that shouldn't have existed. The Erie War, as newspapers called it, destroyed Vanderbilt's attempt at monopoly. It also taught America a terrifying lesson. The stock market could be engineered like machinery. Value was no longer real. It was whatever men like Gould declared it to be. But Gould was just beginning. On September 24, 1869, Gould executed his masterpiece. He called it a gold corner. History called it Black Friday. The mechanics were simple. The consequences were catastrophic. Gould and Fisk secretly bought massive quantities of gold. They drove the price upward. They created artificial scarcity. As gold, prices soared. They prepared to sell at the peak. But the scheme required one critical element. The US Treasury could not release its gold reserves. If government gold flooded the market, prices would collapse. Gould cultivated connections inside President Ulysses S. Grant's administration. He manipulated officials. He fed false information. He convinced them that keeping gold scarce would help farmers by raising crop prices. On September 24th, the gold market imploded. Prices spiked to $160 per ounce, double the normal rate. Panic spread through Wall Street. Businesses that relied on gold-backed credit couldn't function. Import firms faced ruin. Banks froze. The entire economy seized. Gould had already begun selling. He made millions. Fisk made millions. Thousands of others lost everything. When the Treasury finally released government gold to stabilize the market, prices crashed. Fortunes evaporated in minutes. Farmers who had borrowed against rising prices defaulted. Small businesses closed. Workers lost jobs. The shockwave rippled across the nation for months. Gould walked away untouched. Congressional hearings followed. Testimony revealed the manipulation. Witnesses described the conspiracy. But Gould faced no criminal charges. His lawyers were too skilled. His political connections too deep. His money too vast. The public response was visceral. Newspaper editors condemned him. Ministers preached against him. Political cartoonists drew him as a serpent strangling Lady Liberty. The New York Times called him a threat to democracy itself. He became, in the public imagination, the embodiment of industrial greed, the face of corruption, the symbol of a system that rewarded manipulation over production, extraction over creation. And Jay Gould, frail and soft-spoken, seemed utterly unbothered. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, he expanded his empire. He acquired the Union Pacific Railroad. He controlled telegraph lines. He manipulated stock in dozens of companies. His wealth grew into the tens of millions, equivalent to billions today. But wealth alone wasn't enough. Gould needed something more permanent, something that would declare his arrival into the class he'd climbed toward, something that would stand as proof that a farm boy from Roxbury had transcended his origins. In 1880, Gould purchased Lyndhurst. The estate sat on 67 acres overlooking the Hudson River in Tarrytown, New York. It had been built in 1838 for William Paulding, a former New York City mayor. The mansion was Gothic revival, all pointed arches, stone turrets, and dramatic verticality. It looked like something transplanted from medieval Europe, romantic, grand, imposing. When Gould bought it, Lyndhurst was already magnificent, but he transformed it into something else entirely. He hired architects, he expanded the structure, he added a massive conservatory, a glass palace for exotic plants. He installed modern plumbing, he upgraded the heating systems, he reinforced the walls, he surrounded the property with iron fencing. He wasn't building a home for entertaining, he was building a fortress. The mansion's beauty was undeniable. Tall windows filled rooms with light. Carved wood panelling lined the walls. The library held thousands of volumes. The grounds featured manicured gardens, greenhouses, and carefully planned vistas. But every choice served dual purposes. The estate's seclusion protected him from public rage. The gates controlled access. The staff ensured privacy. The beauty projected power. Lyndhurst became the physical manifestation of Gould's philosophy. Control your environment completely, and you control your survival. From these walls, Gould could operate his empire in peace. He could raise his children away from the hatred that followed his name. He could cultivate the image of a family man while manipulating markets that destroyed families. The mansion, he believed, would be his permanent legacy. Stone and land would outlast memory. Architecture would redeem reputation. He had no idea how wrong he was. Lyndhurst required a hidden empire to function. The beauty visible from the Hudson River concealed machinery that consumed money, labour, and constant vigilance. The estate employed between 25 and 35 full-time staff. Groundskeepers maintained the 67 acres. Gardeners cultivated the ornamental landscapes. Coachmen managed the stables and carriages. Kitchen staff prepared meals. Housekeepers cleaned the 24 rooms. Personal servants attended the family. Each worker represented ongoing cost. Annual wages for the household staff alone exceeded $15,000, roughly $450,000 in modern value. That figure didn't include the labourers needed for major renovations, seasonal repairs, or emergency maintenance. The conservatory was particularly expensive. The massive glass structure housed orchids from South America, palms from Africa, and rare ferns from Asia. Maintaining tropical temperatures in New York winters required constant heating. The boilers burned coal around the clock from November through March. Specialized gardeners monitored humidity, pruned delicate specimens, and replaced plants that couldn't survive. Coal costs for the entire estate reached $3,000 per year. Food for the staff added another $4,000. Repairs and materials consumed $8,000 to $12,000 annually. Property taxes on land valued at over $200,000 exceeded $5,000. Gould's total annual operating cost for Lyndhurst, approximately $45,000 to $50,000. In modern terms, that's $1.3 to $1.5 million every single year, just to maintain residency. And this was only one of Gould's properties. He owned a townhouse in Manhattan. He maintained offices across multiple cities. The cost of being Jay Gould was itself an empire-level expense, but money alone couldn't purchase what Gould truly needed: security. He installed reinforced locks on every external door. He hired private guards to patrol the grounds at night. He controlled who received invitations and when they could visit. He rarely appeared in public without planning his route in advance. This wasn't mere caution. It was survival instinct born from genuine threat. Gould received death threats regularly. Letters arrived promising assassination. Strangers appeared at the gates making demands. Workers from failed companies he'd bankrupted sometimes travelled to Tarrytown seeking confrontation. The hatred wasn't abstract. It was personal, specific, and dangerous. Inside Lyndhurst walls, staff observed a man fundamentally at odds with his public image. Newspaper cartoons depicted him as a robust villain. In reality, Gould was thin, soft-voiced, and visibly ill. He suffered chronic coughing fits. He tired easily. He spent hours in the conservatory because the humid air helped his breathing. He was also a devoted father. He had 6 children with his wife, Helen. He paid for their education. He involved himself in their interests. He built the estate's amenities partly for their enjoyment: a bowling alley, a swimming pool, extensive grounds for recreation. Yet even fatherhood couldn't escape his reputation's shadow. His children grew up knowing their last name carried poison. They heard the public mockery. They saw the editorial cartoons. They understood that invitations to certain social circles would never arrive. Old money families, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, might tolerate Gould's presence at business functions, but their daughters would never marry his sons. Their social gatherings excluded his daughters. Helen Gould tried to create normalcy. She managed the household. She organised the children's education. She maintained relationships with the few families willing to associate with them. But she couldn't shield them from the fundamental truth. Their wealth was built on public destruction, and the public would never forget. The mansion itself reflected this tension. The formal rooms projected elegance. The library suggested intellectual cultivation. The art collection implied refined taste. But the security measures told a different story. The isolation revealed deeper purpose. The whole estate functioned as both showcase and bunker. Gould's daily routine reinforced this duality. He woke early. He ate breakfast with family. Then he retreated to his private office and spent hours managing his empire. Telegraph wires connected Lyndhurst to his business operations. He tracked stock movements. He issued orders. He orchestrated deals that affected thousands of workers he would never meet. From his desk overlooking the Hudson, Gould manipulated railroad rates that determined whether grain farmers could afford to ship crops. He controlled telegraph lines that transmitted the news his stock manipulations created. He held enough Union Pacific stock to influence which towns would receive rail service and which would be bypassed into economic irrelevance. The servants who brought him lunch had no idea that his morning decisions might have just bankrupted a mining company in Colorado or triggered layoffs at a manufacturing plant in Ohio. The gardeners trimming hedges outside his window couldn't have known that his afternoon telegrams might prevent a union from negotiating better wages. This was the hidden architecture of Gilded Age power. Wealth didn't flow naturally to men like Gould. It was extracted through systems designed for extraction. Railroads charged monopolistic rates. Stock manipulation transferred money from naive investors to informed operators. Telegraph control meant information reached Gould before it reached markets, providing decisive advantage in every transaction. Lyndhurst was both command centre and refuge from the consequences. The estate's beauty served a psychological function for Gould. He could look at the gardens and see permanence. He could walk the grounds and feel ownership. He could invite the rare business ally and demonstrate that he had achieved what farm boys weren't supposed to achieve. But beauty couldn't alter the fundamental instability of his position. His wealth depended on active manipulation. If he stopped orchestrating schemes, his income would collapse. Railroad stocks only held value if he maintained control. Telegraph monopolies only generated profit if he prevented competition. Every dollar required defending, and his health was failing. By the mid-1880s, Gould's tuberculosis worsened. He coughed blood. He lost weight. He spent increasing time in the conservatory seeking relief. Doctors prescribed rest. He ignored them. His empire couldn't manage itself. Helen watched her husband deteriorate. The children saw their father weaken. The staff observed a man clinging to control even as his body betrayed him. Meanwhile, America was changing. The Interstate Commerce Act passed in 1887, creating federal railroad regulation. Public anger over monopolies was building political pressure. Labor movements were organizing strikes. The very systems that had allowed Gould to accumulate his fortune were beginning to face challenges. But Gould had spent decades believing that money and control could overcome any obstacle. He'd manipulated presidents. He'd defeated Vanderbilt. He'd survived Black Friday. He convinced himself that willpower alone could sustain both his health and his empire. The mansion stood as testament to that conviction, proof that he'd built something permanent, something that would outlast the hatred and survive the opposition. He was about to discover that some forces cannot be manipulated or controlled. In the spring of 1892, Jay Gould's cough turned violent. Blood appeared more frequently. Weight dropped from his already thin frame. Doctors confirmed what his family had feared. The tuberculosis was winning. Gould retreated further into Lyndhurst. He spent hours in the conservatory. The humid air provided temporary relief, but the disease was systemic. His lungs were failing. No amount of money could purchase the medical advancement needed to save him. By November, he was confined to bed. His children gathered. Helen maintained vigil. The staff moved quietly through the halls, and outside the estate, newspapers began their countdown. The coverage was unprecedented. Major dailies tracked Gould's decline with detailed updates. They printed medical bulletins. They speculated about his will. They calculated the value of his holdings. Some publications barely concealed their eagerness. The New York Times ran near-daily updates. The headline progression told the story. Jay Gould very ill became Jay Gould sinking became the end is near. On December 2nd, 1892, at 9:15 in the morning, Jay Gould died inside Lyndhurst. He was 56 years old. His children surrounded him. His wife held his hand. The estate's staff stood in respectful silence. Then word reached the public. What happened next revealed the depth of America's hatred. Crowds gathered in New York City. People cheered. Strangers congratulated each other on the street. Saloons offered free drinks to celebrate. Workers who'd lost jobs to Gould's railroad manipulations raised glasses. Investors who'd been ruined by his stock schemes smiled for the first time in years. Newspaper responses range from measured to gleeful. The New York Herald wrote, "Gould died as he had lived, friendless and alone, save for his family." The Kansas City Star declared, "The earth is a little lighter today." The Rocky Mountain News stated simply, "The death of Jay Gould removes a dangerous man." Editorial cartoonists had a field day. One depicted Gould arriving at Hell's Gates while the devil nervously checked his wallet. Another showed him being weighed on scales of justice, found severely wanting. Ministers gave sermons about divine judgment. They didn't name Gould explicitly. They didn't need to. Everyone knew whom they meant when they spoke of the wages of greed and the corruption of the soul through money. Inside Lyndhurst, the family processed grief amid this public celebration. They could hear the cheering from nearby Tarrytown. They read the newspaper coverage. They understood that no amount of mourning could compete with the nation's relief. The funeral was small. Gould had left instructions. Private ceremony, minimal fanfare. He knew that a public funeral would attract protesters, not mourners. But even in death, he couldn't escape controversy. His will revealed an estate valued at approximately $72 million, roughly $2.3 billion today. He left the majority to his 6 children, with strict instructions about maintaining control of his railroad holdings. He hoped they would continue his empire. Instead, his empire began to fracture immediately. Business rivals sensed opportunity. They challenged Gould's stock positions. They undermined his railroad control. They exploited the leadership vacuum. Within weeks, Union Pacific stock prices declined. Telegraph companies he'd controlled faced new competition. His children tried to maintain the empire. George Gould, the eldest son, took control of the railroad operations, but George lacked his father's ruthlessness. He preferred negotiation to manipulation. He wanted to be respected, not feared. The difference proved fatal to the Gould business model. Railroad regulation was increasing. The Interstate Commerce Commission was gaining power. Public sentiment demanded reform. The very tactics Jay Gould had pioneered, stock manipulation, rate discrimination, monopolistic control, were becoming illegal. Meanwhile, lawsuits multiplied. Former business partners claimed Gould had cheated them. Investors filed suit over manipulated stock prices. Railroad workers demanded back wages. The legal battles consumed time, money, and energy. Lyndhurst itself became a burden. The annual operating costs didn't decrease with Gould's death. The estate still required 30 staff members. The gardens still needed maintenance. The conservatory still demanded coal. The property taxes continued. But the income that had supported this expense was no longer reliable. The railroad holdings generated less profit under George's management. Telegraph revenues declined as competition increased. The Gould fortune, while still massive, was no longer growing, it was contracting. The children faced an impossible choice: maintain their father's empire and watch it slowly fail, or liquidate assets and preserve their inheritance. They chose maintenance. For years they tried to keep the system functioning. They paid the staff. They maintained Lyndhurst. They operated the railroads. They projected confidence. But confidence couldn't alter economic reality. The Gilded Age was ending. Progressive reformers were gaining political power. Theodore Roosevelt would soon become president, bringing aggressive antitrust enforcement. The era of individual tycoons controlling entire industries was closing. Jay Gould had built his empire at the perfect historical moment, when industrial expansion created opportunities for manipulation, when regulation was minimal, when public anger hadn't yet translated to political action. He'd extracted maximum wealth from that moment. But moments pass, systems change, and empires built on extraction and fear cannot adapt to regulation and accountability. Lyndhurst stood as the physical reminder of this transition. The mansion's stone walls remained beautiful. The grounds stayed manicured. The architecture still impressed visitors. But the purpose had evaporated. The fortress no longer needed to protect anyone. The command center no longer directed an empire. The symbol of permanence was becoming a relic. What would happen to a mansion built for a man whose death made a nation celebrate? George Gould tried to be a different kind of tycoon. He negotiated with labor unions. He invested in railroad improvements. He avoided the manipulative schemes that had made his father wealthy and hated. The result was predictable. He lost money. Railroad competition intensified. Federal regulation limited profitable tactics. Operating costs increased as unions negotiated better wages. Stock prices for Gould-controlled lines stagnated. By 1910, George had lost effective control of most of his father's railroad empire. The other Gould children fared similarly. They spent their inheritances maintaining the lifestyle their father had established, but they couldn't generate new wealth at his pace. The fortune was immense, but finite. Every year decreased it. Lyndhurst became increasingly difficult to justify. The annual operating cost of $50,000 represented a significant drain on resources that were no longer replenishing. The mansion sat empty for long periods. The children lived primarily in New York City. The estate functioned more as an expensive storage facility than a home. In 1938, Anna Gould, one of Jay's daughters, inherited the property. She was 64 years old. She had married a French count and lived primarily in Europe. She had no interest in maintaining a massive American estate she rarely visited. The practical question became unavoidable. What do you do with a mansion built for a man everyone hated? You couldn't sell it easily. Who would buy a property associated with America's most notorious robber baron? Who could afford the operating costs? Who wanted to live in a Gothic fortress that symbolized Gilded Age excess? Anna considered options. Demolition would be expensive and wasteful. Conversion to another purpose seemed impractical. The mansion was too specific, too residential, too isolated. Then preservationists intervened. By the 1930s, architectural historians were beginning to recognize Gilded Age estates as culturally significant. They represented a unique moment in American history, when industrial wealth created domestic spaces of unprecedented scale and grandeur. Love them or hate them, these mansions told important stories. Lyndhurst's architecture was particularly notable. The Gothic Revival style, designed by Alexander Jackson Davis, represented one of the finest examples of the genre in America. The craftsmanship was exceptional. The building's influence on later architecture was significant. The National Trust for Historic Preservation approached Anna Gould. They proposed saving Lyndhurst not because of Jay Gould, but despite him. The mansion's value was architectural, not biographical. Anna agreed. In 1961, she donated Lyndhurst to the National Trust. The estate became a museum. Tours began. Historians studied it. Architecture students visited. The mansion that had been built as a fortress against public hatred became a public destination. The grounds that had been closed and guarded became open and welcoming. The symbol of private extraction became a preserved example of public heritage. The irony was profound. Jay Gould had built Lyndhurst to establish permanent dynasty. He'd spent millions to create a stone legacy that would outlast the newspaper attacks and public condemnation. He'd believed that architecture could redeem reputation. He was partially right. The architecture survived. But not for the reasons he'd intended. Lyndhurst exists today because people recognised value in what Gould had built, not in who he was. The preservation was an act of cultural conservation, not personal redemption. Visitors tour the mansion to understand Gilded Age design and craftsmanship. Gould himself is a footnote, the notorious original owner whose story adds context but not significance. The mansion outlived the empire, the estate outlasted the wealth, the building survived the dynasty, but the system that created it collapsed completely. The tactics Gould pioneered, stock manipulation, monopolistic control, information advantage, are now illegal. The Interstate Commerce Commission evolved into modern transportation regulation. The Securities and Exchange Commission prevents the stock schemes that funded Black Friday. Antitrust law limits the consolidation that built his railroad empire. The progressive reforms of the early 20th century dismantled the structures that had enabled Gould's wealth, not quickly, not completely, but steadily and systematically. The legal framework changed, the political environment shifted, the public tolerance for extraction-based fortunes evaporated. By 1920, the Gould family's railroad holdings were scattered among various companies. The telegraph monopolies were broken. The fortune had been divided, spent, and diminished. The children and grandchildren remained wealthy by normal standards, but the empire was gone, and Jay Gould's reputation never recovered. Modern historians debate his significance. Some credit him with pioneering financial techniques that became standard practice. Others condemn him as a symbol of unrestricted capitalism's worst excesses. But nobody defends him as a hero. Nobody suggests his methods should be emulated. The mansion tells this story better than any biography could. Walk through Lyndhurst today, and you'll see beautiful rooms, careful craftsmanship, and thoughtful design. You'll learn about Gothic Revival architecture. You'll admire the conservatory. You'll appreciate the landscape planning. But you'll also see something else. The physical proof that power built on fear and extraction cannot create lasting legacy. The mansion survives because preservationists valued architecture over reputation. The estate endures because public institutions funded its maintenance. The building stands because people recognized heritage value, not because Gould's dynasty protected it. Everything Gould tried to secure through wealth, permanence, respect, legacy, eluded him. Everything he tried to control, public opinion, historical judgment, family dynasty, escaped his grasp. The fortress couldn't protect him. The beauty couldn't redeem him. The stone walls couldn't preserve his empire. What survived was the thing he built, divorced from the man who built it. Perhaps that's the most fitting legacy. Lyndhurst stands as a monument not to Jay Gould's power, but to its limits. The mansion endures not because of his success, but despite his methods. The estate teaches visitors not about the triumph of Gilded Age wealth, but about its fundamental instability. The crowds that cheered his death in 1892 understood something Gould never did. You cannot build permanent dynasty on temporary suffering. You cannot create lasting respect through widespread fear. You cannot engineer public memory the way you engineer markets. Some forces resist manipulation. Some costs exceed any fortune. Some legacies survive only by being separated from their creators. Lyndhurst remains beautiful, but it stands as evidence of a simple truth. Power built on fear cannot last. The Gilded Age created dozens of estates like Lyndhurst, each one a story of ambition, wealth, and transformation. Some belonged to families who maintained respect. Others housed tycoons whose reputations rivaled Gould's notoriety. Which estate should we explore next? The Breakers, where Vanderbilt wealth tried to buy social acceptance. Biltmore, where architectural ambition exceeded economic sustainability. Or perhaps one of the lesser-known mansions whose stories reveal different truths about American wealth. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story valuable, consider subscribing. And if you know someone fascinated by history's hidden machinery, the real costs and consequences behind America's most impressive buildings, send them this video. Some houses tell stories larger than their walls contain. Lyndhurst is one of them.